Mississippi now, and we used to ride four-wheelers together, and he said that there's always a person, a lot of times had a person up front that had a broomstick sticking up because of the trails were just covered in spider webs. And like, that is why I do not ride four-wheelers in this house. No way. Even when we rode up here, somebody else was always in front to catch them. No, thank you. All right, well, we are in Acts chapter 18 this morning. Finished up 17 last week, and we just barely got started in chapter 18, if I remember right. Just started talking about Aquila and Priscilla. Anybody got a note where it was at? I think that's where we got to. Just to start there. And so, somebody want to read chapter 18, verse 1 through 4 to get us started. Again, please.
After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. And he went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath, and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks.
All right, so we're looking at Aquila and Priscilla. Paul has left Athens. He's went to Corinth. We're going to spend a little time talking about Corinth. We're going to find out Paul does spend, really 18 months in Corinth, which is a long time for Paul because he doesn't usually spend that much time in an area, maybe a few weeks, maybe a month. And the reason was who was trying to chase him out everywhere he went? The Jews. And so every place he went, the Jews would cause problems, they'd make him leave. Well, we're going to find out that they tried to do that here, and they got stopped. And so he's in Corinth, and he has now met Aquila and Priscilla, and that's who we were talking about. They were friends of Paul. Paul mentions them several times from this point on, how they were friends. They were already Christians when Paul met them. When were they converted to Christianity? They were from Pontus, which Pontus was mentioned as one of the places in Acts chapter 2 of those people that were there on the day of Pentecost and listened to the first gospel sermon. They could have been a part of the 3,000 that were saved. We don't know. It'd be interesting if that was, because then they would have went back to Rome and would have helped possibly start the congregations that were there. We know Paul did not go to Rome or had not been to Rome yet. And we know that by the first chapter of Romans. And so it's interesting to see their part in that. And they were very evangelistic. There's a purpose that we're going to see them talking to Apollos in Ephesus later at the end of the chapter. They were very evangelistic in their desire. And so, but the reason that they had left Rome was that Claudius had made the Jews leave. Now, they were Jews. Now, for a Roman, he didn't know the difference between a Christian and those that were Jews. Aquila and Priscilla being Jews, they would have been, that's their heritage, where they grew up. And so Claudius had banned all of Jews from Rome for the period of time that he was ruling. This would have been Claudius ruled from about 42 to 54 AD. And so we kind of get the date of when Paul was in Corinth based upon that. So roughly this passage would have been probably written about 52 AD when this was talked about. So it had been in the last 2 years. Clark made this comment in regards to this occasion of Claudius, what he had done. He said the edict of the Roman emperor is not mentioned by Josephus, but it is probably the same in which Suetonius refers to in his life of Claudius, where he says, Judius, implosure Christo, Asaidu, I'm not even going to try, that's all That's all Greek. He expelled the Jews from Rome as they were making continual insurrections until their leader, Christus. And so he had expelled the Jews. He hated the Jews. Claudius did. And did not, and some believe that name Christus there was a relation to Christ and him not understanding the difference between Christians and Jews. And so he looked at the Jews as a people that needed to be gone because they were causing problems, and remove them from his area. And so that caused Aquila and Priscilla to leave Rome and to end up in Corinth here. And this city, really the Roman city after his death, after he died, which he was poisoned. If you look at a lot of the Roman emperors, how they died was not very good. Usually it was not pleasant. But he was poisoned and replaced. And after that, Jews went back to Rome because there was no oppression from them anymore. But as we talked about, Aquila and Priscilla left because of that. We're told that in the passage here. And somebody read Romans 1, 8 through 12. Romans 1, 8 through 12.
First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, that your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world. For God is my witness, whom I serve with my spirit in the gospel of his Son, that without ceasing I make mention of you always in my prayers, making request if, by some means, now at last I may find a way in the will of God to come to you. For I long to see you, that I may impart to you some spiritual gift, so that you may be established. That is, that I may be encouraged together with you by the mutual faith both of you and me.
All right, so two things mentioned there by Paul. He desired to see them. He longed to see them. He prayed for the day that he would be able to go and see them. Now, it doesn't state that he had not seen them before, but by the implication there, it is saying that Paul has not met the Romans, and he desired to go there. Well, of course, in his fourth missionary journey, what's going to happen? He's going to end up going to Rome, and not in the way that he planned, but he will end up there. The second thing is Paul stated that he wanted to impart a spiritual gift upon them. What does that mean? Since they didn't have a spiritual gift, what does that mean? Yeah. Who was those ones that were able to do that? The apostles. And so if you have a group of Christians in Rome who did not have any miraculous abilities at that time, that means they were not taught by an apostle. That means that Paul had not been there because he desired to be there. That also means Peter hadn't been there. And that's important too, because there's a doctrine that teaches that Peter, being the first pope, was the one to start the congregation, the church in Rome. That's not the case. And so here it states that this congregation, or the congregations around Rome, I teach Brother Mosier in school when he taught Rome and said it's not just one congregation, there were several around the area of Rome, means that they were taught by someone else. They were taught by a Christian, just possibly Aquila and Priscilla, who had went to Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost, Acts chapter 2, converted to Christianity, brought it back, and started to evangelize. We know they had an evangelistic spirit, so it could have been them. But we don't know. We just speculate. It's neat to think about the connections that are there. But it's amazing to see a congregation that was started not by Paul in a Gentile area. It was a congregation or congregations that was started by a normal Christian that was just spreading the gospel.
But Rome is a very populated place, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so people would come and go.
Yep.
So they probably heard the gospel somewhere, because we've talked many times about how it got spread,
Yep.
you know.
Yeah. There could have been all kinds of people that went in and out of there. They're Christians because they still had their businesses, and Rome was the center of everything. at that time. And so the gospel would have been brought in by somebody. Now, to think it could have been Aquila and Priscilla, I'm sure they had a part in that, but it just needs to think of the connections there. But it wasn't an apostle, so that's important to remember. All right, so verse 3, it says, "So because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for by occupation they were tent makers." And so we learn here that they both were of the same trade. Kaufman said all Jews, even the wealthy and learned, were taught a trade. The Jewish law after their exile held that a father who taught not his son a trade taught him to be a thief. And so that was a quote, from some writers during that time, but it stated that every Jew during that time was taught a trade. So here the trade that Paul had, we learn, is a tent maker. Now, we use that phrase a lot of times when we reference Paul, because when he worked as a preacher, worked as a minister, he also was a tent maker. And so that phrase is used a lot to say someone who preaches and also works, tent makes. And that's what Paul did. He was supported by Antioch. He was supported by other congregations in the work that he did and in the areas that he worked. But he also worked at night to help support himself. And one of those things was tent making. And so here he met two people that are Christians that have the same evangelistic spirit as him and also have the same trade. So they're going to hit it off, and he does. He stays there with them, and they work together in that trade. The word tent maker is one who makes small portable tents, which makes sense. It says of leather or cloth or goat's hair or linen for the use of travelers. What was important, if you remember, about Corinth that we talked about, I think, last week? Remember, Corinth is right here, and Achaia, right here between this peninsula, basically between this land, this area, these two bodies of land. What was very important about Corinth? Trade. A lot of people went through Corinth. And so makes sense what Paul was able to do. He was a tent maker. As people traveled through, it would have been good for their business. And maybe that's why Aquila and Priscilla stopped here, because of the ability to support themselves with the amount of people going through there. So we read Acts 20 and verse 34.
Yea, ye yourselves know that these hands have ministered unto my necessities, and to them that were with me.
Okay, so mentioning his use of his hands and supporting himself. 2 Thessalonians 3, 9 through 10.
Not because we do not have authority, but to make ourselves an example of how you should follow us. For even when we were with you, we commanded you this: if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat.
Okay, and so I think that's with a reference to Paul and the culture of the Jewish time, but also the importance of working. And so, Paul, there's other passages that talks about the fact that a person is worthy of their hire in reference to preachers, also a reference to elders. And talking about in that context, elders spend a lot of time doing the work of the church. You don't really see that very often where elders are paid for their work, but Paul says in another place that that is the case, that elders should be paid if they desire to, because they are working. I think when we, hopefully in the future we have elders here, it's going to be a full-time job for them. Congregations that do have elders, they put a lot of time into shepherding the flock. They put a lot of time into making sure things are going the way they need to be going and watching over the congregation. And it's going to take a lot of their time personally and away from possibly their business or whatever the case may be. And so there is that need there. And so we look at Paul, he desired to not be a burden all the time on the places that he went. And so he would try to work and to support himself while he went along. And he finds Aquila and Priscilla, and they're doing the same trade. And so it's just interesting to see that.
Isn't that the same way with preachers today? I mean, we pay you, but you still have other jobs to support yourself and your family.
Yeah.
And I know some preachers, I'm not saying Church of Christ preachers or any other, but some of them expect to be supported by the congregation.
Yeah.
Housing, utilities, food, anything that they need, babysitting,
Yeah. It's a lot different. Like, yeah, that's what I do. I'm supported by the congregation here, but I also have other jobs to make a living. Because, you get to the South, there's people that don't, they just are supported by the congregation, and that's it. But they're a lot bigger congregations. But yeah, it's different in other areas. I don't know about taking care of their food and all that stuff, but and babysitting, I'm not sure about that. But I mean, you know what?
I'm not babysitting.
You're not babysitting. We got Cassie; she's a babysitter now. Yeah, and so when we look at that, Paul, he was an example of one that preached and worked. But we do have examples of, and Paul even states, he says, he even regretted, I'm trying to think of, I know it's in 2 Corinthians, but Paul said that he regretted not fully being supported by that congregation he was at. I think it was Thessalonica, because of not Thessalonica, it was Corinth, because they did not want to be very supportive of a minister. And he thought that he should have acquired more from them while he was there. But we see the example here, and I like this example. I always like Paul because I like to preach, but I also like to do other things. And there's many that do, and I think it helps in what Paul was doing. You think about what he was able with his trade to do. Not only was he able to support himself, but meet people. Here he is, the places that he would go. He would meet people and be able to discuss the gospel with them, and I think that's important, especially for someone that dedicates their life to ministering. Yep.
Doesn't Paul also at one place say that he doesn't want to be supported by people? That's why he supports himself, so that nobody can boast that they support him.
Yep, exactly. He did say that also. I'm trying to think where it was at. I don't remember. I have to look for it. But yes, he did. He said that, and he also said of the person's worthy of their hire. So he had both. But for him personally, he wanted to work and to have his trade so that he was not a burden upon the places that he went. Because you think about a lot of the times where he was going, there was no congregation at all. He was establishing them. Rome was definitely one that was not that way. But he had to, for the most part. But he was also supported by Antioch in the work that he did.
And it also gives you an opportunity to teach by working out with the public.
Yeah. I think in areas like where we live now, I think that's the case too. It's good to have other things going on so that you can meet people. It's the same as, we all as a congregation have that responsibility, and in our daily lives we're supposed to be talking about the gospel. So it's good. It's just different. Culture's different in different areas. You go into the South, the culture's different. I think the culture's different up here from a lot of places that I've seen, and I like it here. But all right, anything else on that? All right, so we look at and we see Paul's trade, and then so verse 4, it says, and he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded Jews and Greeks. And so Paul was able to work in the synagogue here and convince as Strong states there, persuaded or convinced people to believe the truth. And so, as he always does, he reasoned with the Jews and reasoned with Greeks, probably the proselytes in this synagogue. But what's interesting is what we find happens now from verse 5 through verse 17. Somebody want to read 5 through 17? Or it gets blooded up, I guess.
I'll start it. And when Silas and Timothy were come from Macedonia, Paul was pressed in the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus was Christ. And when they opposed themselves and blasphemed, he took his raiment and said unto them, Your blood be upon your own heads. I am clean. From henceforth I will go unto the Gentiles. And he departed thence and entered into a certain man's house named
Justice, yep.
Justus, one that worshipped God, whose house joined hard to the synagogue.
Then Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his household, and many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed and were baptized. Now the Lord spoke to Paul in the night by a vision, Do not be afraid, but speak, and do not keep silent. For I am with you, and no one will attack you to hurt you, for I have many people in this city. And he continued there a year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them.
All right, we can stop there for, we'll just study this part first. All right, so verse 5, when Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia. Now remember, Paul had left Silas and Timothy in Macedonia because he had to flee. So they were up in Thessalonica, or Berea, in that area. And Paul had to leave because of the persecution, but he left Silas and Timothy there. And so they had to continue to work, and Paul told them to meet him where he was at, which was now Corinth. Now it's interesting, this timing would have possibly be when Paul wrote 1 Thessalonians. Because if you go and start reading the book of Thessalonians, the first chapter, Paul starts talking about the fact that he had a report of the things that was going on there. And so this would have been Silas and Timothy, because we know he wrote 1 Thessalonians here. More than likely, it was his first book that he wrote. Some would say that he wrote Galatians, or letter, we call it letters. Wrote the letter to the Galatians first, but I think it's 1 Thessalonians. And so as Silas and Timothy meet him, they tell him of the things that's going on, and now we have the first letter to the Thessalonians. And so while he was here, and after Timothy and Silas had come to him, Paul was compelled by the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus is Christ. So the word compelled means, it's literally to squeeze, to take prisoner, to afflict. That's what it really focuses on, that afflicting, to take prisoner. And so the idea of that was that he was compelled, he felt that need to stay there. The ASV says constrained by the word, and I think the ESV, what does it say? Verse 5.
Occupied by the word, testifying to the Jews. Is that what we're
No, verse 5 says Paul was compelled by the Spirit.
Paul was occupied.
He was occupied. Okay. And so occupied by the word. And so it could be the fact that the Spirit was telling Paul to stay there. It was encouraging him to speak up and to go and show his zeal and teach people about the gospel. But he was already doing that. But then there's the other side of it. It could be, because by how the ASV and the ESV reads, it's more focused on the word was compelling him. The message that he had was compelling him to do it, which is very similar to, somebody read Jeremiah 20, verse 9.
Then I said, I will make mention of him, nor speak any more in his name. But his word was in my heart like a burning fire, shut up in my bones. I was weary of holding it back, and I
All right, so Jeremiah, faced with death, at one point he was thrown in a pit where he was sunk down to his chin in mud and left to die, was hated by the people, hated terribly by the people, because he was telling them that they were going to go into bondage. They didn't want to hear it. They hated his guts. And so in Jeremiah 20, he's ready to stop. He's ready to be done. He's like, God has given me this message to tell the people I'm supposed to be telling them. They don't want to hear me. They hate my guts. I don't want to do it anymore. But then verse 9 says that the word was in his heart like a fire, right? And it compelled him. He had to say it. He knew the message. He had a love for the people. He knew they needed to hear it. And so it kept him going. It kept him pushing forward and doing what God wanted him to do. And so I feel like that's kind of what's going on here. It could have been the Spirit just compelling him because he was inspired. But I think the message and the love for the people that was there, and for one, he's in the synagogue, so he's around Jews. We already know Paul had a soft spot for his brethren, the Jews, wanted to teach them the gospel. He wanted them to hear the truth. And so it could have been that. It could have been just that message and his love that he had for the people. It compelled him to push forward and to teach the Jews about Christ. But we know Paul had zeal. Somebody read Philippians 3, 5 through 6.
Circumcised the 8th day of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of the Hebrews, as touching the law, a Pharisee. Concerning zeal, persecuting the church, touching the righteousness which is in the law, blameless.
All right, Paul talked about his zeal there. His zeal was strong when he was opposing Christianity, and it was also strong when he was teaching the gospel once he found the truth. And so Paul had a great zeal, and it compelled him to tell the Jews, because he loved them. They were his people. And so then verse 6, it says, but when they opposed him and blasphemed, this is talking about the Jews, he shook his garments and said to them, your blood be upon your own heads, I am clean. From now on I will go to the Gentiles. You know, that's a pretty bold thing for Paul to say, especially because of the love that he had for his brethren. And we've looked at that. For him to say, you know what, I'm done. I'm done with you people, in a sense. You don't want to listen. You don't care. And not only that, they disagreed, but they also blasphemed. They were blaspheming the name of Christ. They had no care at all for what Paul had to say. They had no care at all for the truth. They wanted to stay in what they were doing. And so they made fun of Christ. They blasphemed him. All of this. And Paul says, I'm done. I've had it. I've had it with you people and what you believe. And my hands are clean. It's kind of similar to what lost the name, Pilate did with Christ, right? The people wanted Christ to die. Pilate said, I don't believe he should. I'm going to wash my hands of this. It's very similar to that. Paul is saying, I have told you the truth. I have reasoned with you. I have shown you everything you need to know. You don't care. I'm washing my hands of this. And so the phrase that he uses is that he took his garment off. But it says, blood be upon your hands, or he shook his garments and said to them. So that reference there of shaking the garment, Barnes says, in an expressive act of shaking off the guilt of their condemnation. He shook his raiment to show that he was resolved henceforth to have nothing to do with them, perhaps also to express the fact that God would soon slake them off or reject them. And so, you know, it's kind of similar to what did Jesus say to his disciples when he sent them out on the first commission, when they went into the different cities. If they didn't hear him, what did he say? Shake the dust off their feet. Very similar. So Paul, in a visual way, shakes his garment and says, your blood is on your hands. And so that guilt that he felt for them and the fact that He wanted them to know the truth. He felt guilty if he didn't tell them. That was gone, because now they knew. And that's no different than today. You know, we can strive to teach the truth to someone, but if they, or people, different people, if they don't want to hear it, and we've tried and tried and tried, sometimes there's a point we just need to be done and shake our hands of it, or wash our hands of it, and say, your guilt, or the guilt, your blood is on your hands. Your choice is now, it's yours. I mean, which it was in the first place. But Paul is saying, I've done everything I can. And sometimes we have to do that too. We have to say, you know what, we've done everything we can. Now it's up to you. You've got all the tools. You've got all the information. You've got all the truth. Now you need to make a choice. And I think you think about the fact that here he is in Corinth and this has happened to him. And I couldn't help but think of 1 Corinthians 3. Somebody read verse 11 through 15. You know, he's probably thinking about this again as he writes this letter to the Corinthians, thinking about what had happened here. And so 1 Corinthians 3, 11 through 15.
For no other foundation can anyone lay than which is set, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if anyone build on this foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become clear, for the day will declare it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test each one's work of what sort it is. If anyone's work which he has built on it endures, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burnt, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, yet so as through fire.
Okay, so in the context, Paul is talking about the gospel. He starts out chapter 3 and talking about the gospel and teaching the gospel to them. And we get to this point, Paul, there's two things he's looking at. First, he's talking about the person that's heard the truth. Okay? So the person that's heard the truth, they have the foundation. The foundation of faith, the foundation of the gospel is Christ. And so a person makes the choice to where they're going to build their foundation. They're going to build it on the truth, on Christ, or they're going to build it upon some false truth, which is, today could be denominationalism. And so he's saying the person that builds upon that true foundation, when that time comes, where judgment day comes, they'll be tested by fire. And something that's built upon a true foundation, which is that stone, which is Christ, will stand. And those that's built on another foundation that's not the true foundation will not stand. And so there's the responsibility upon the person that hears the truth. But in verse 15 is a reference to the one that teaches that person the truth. And Paul is saying, even though if that person builds upon a wrong foundation, makes the wrong choice, does not believe the truth, and their foundation is destroyed in judgment, the person that taught them the truth is not responsible, because they have done their part to bring the gospel to them. And I think that Paul is thinking about this occasion here when he wrote this, and he's saying, I've done my part, they have their choice to make, and if they're not on the right foundation at the end, it's on them. But I have done my part. And so we can think about that today. We have to do our part. And we can only go so far. We can't force someone to obey the truth, can we? Personal responsibility. Every person has their own choices to make, and that's free will. It's what God has given us. And so Paul, he's saying, I've done, the blood is upon your hands, I'm now going to the Gentiles. Now, if a Jew heard that, what would they think? Imagine what's going through their minds. Paul says, blood's on your own hands, I am now leaving you, and I'm going to the Gentiles. What are they going to think? They're going to be upset. For one, because, Paul is saying, I'm going to take this truth, I'm going to teach them about the gospel. I mean, they're going to be upset, and they are. And we find that they, again, want to destroy Paul. They want to stop him. And so, verse 7, it says, and he departed from there and entered the house of a certain man named Justus, one who worshiped God, whose house was next door to the synagogue. And so he's right up against the synagogue where he was just at. He went into Justus's house. Some believe that he moved from living with Aquila and Priscilla to Justus. I don't think that's the case. I think it's the fact that he went from the synagogue to this member of the church, his house, this Christian's house, to teach there. So he's still really close to the synagogue. And here he begins to teach. And in verse 8 it says, Then Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his household, and many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed and were baptized. And so now we have the church is being established here in Corinth. Crispus was a leader of the synagogue. That's a pretty big deal to have the leader of the synagogue convert to Christianity. That means his whole livelihood, his whole but his life and what he was doing is now changed. He is not anymore over this synagogue. He's, in a sense, he's got another job he's got to find another job. He's lost his job.
Crispus would have been a Jew, right?
Yes, Crispus was a Jew because he was a leader of the synagogue. And so with Paul being positioned right by the synagogue, maybe Crispus became interested from the things that he said and came over and taught. Clark said this about the person who was the leader of the synagogue. Do you guys have this? Did I get off our notes? There you go. We're about out of time. My printer ran out, so hopefully we got enough for everybody. Got two left. I'll get some more like next week. And so Clark says this about the leader of the synagogue and what his duties were. He stated that it belonged to the chief of the rulers of the synagogue to preside in all assemblies, interpret the law, decide concerning things lawful and unlawful, punish the refractory, excommunicate the rebellious, solemnize marriages, and issue divorces. And so that was, of course, in looking at the old law. And so he had a great responsibility and a lot of things, responsibilities there in the synagogue, and now he's not doing that anymore. And so what's interesting, somebody read, this will be our last passage, 1 Corinthians 10. Well, actually, no. I wanted to talk about some stuff there. In 1 Corinthians 1, just kind of a preview, and really in verse 14, Paul says, I am glad that I did not baptize anyone in Corinth besides Crispus and Gaius. And so Paul only baptized two people, and one of them was Crispus here. And he mentions that later, and we're going to talk about some more of that in 1 Corinthians 1. But Crispus is going to be replaced. In verse 17, which we haven't got there yet, he was replaced by Sosthenes. And if you read ahead, Sosthenes is beaten because of what the Jews try to do here. So Crispus really avoided that. And so, interesting enough. But anyways, we'll pick up here next week. Thank you guys for your time.